Good afternoon, everybody. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the different leadership between the Confederate States and the Northern States. Today we're going to talk a little bit about Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis was born in Kentucky and he lived in Mississippi. He actually was a Mexican War veteran and he was several times senator of Mississippi to the U.S. Congress. And when the subject of secession came up, Mr. Davis was completely and totally against it. Contrary to what some people believe in mainstream society, many of the Southerners who eventually did side with the South were strongly against secession. Jefferson Davis being one of them, Robert E. Lee being another one, Jubal Early being one of them, and the list goes on and on and on of people who did not want to see their state secede. And so when the lower South seceded in 1861, they merely appointed him to be his president. There was no actual election. They figured he's the best man suited for the job. And so he accepted the position humbly, and he became president, and first in Montgomery, and then when Richmond seceded, they agreed to move the capital up there. Now, Davis was in a difficult situation right from the start. He knew his nation was outgunned, outmanned, and outsupplied. And he knew that in a long-term war, they could not win against the North. For example, he was also in a situation where he was not in a position to really make many big decisions. The Southern states seceded on the premise that the president would have very limited powers, the executive office. The power would be with the states, not with the president. And so there were many times where Davis needed supplies, or other armies needed men. And he'd have to simply ask the states that they would give him. And a lot of times they wouldn't. You had the Army Northern Virginia at one point who was starving and barefoot, and when Sherman got down into Georgia, they had so much food and everyone was so well taken care of, they didn't know what to do with themselves because the states wouldn't hand it over. They said, we have given enough and we're pretty much done handing over to this army. And another problem he had, actually something he did have that with his eccentricities he did have, was a good soldier in General Lee. He did not get along well with Joseph E. Johnston, as there's problems there right out the gate. Braxton Bragg was actually a good friend of his, but Braxton Bragg did so much trouble in Tennessee, so that didn't show well on him. But with Robert E. Lee, where Robert E. Lee had success with President Davis, as William C. Davis, a historian, said that there's two types of sucking up. There's a sucking up where you're trying to get a position, get authority, or get privilege, and then there's the kind of sucking up you do when you need to get what you need, basically buttering the other side up so they'll work with you. Robert E. Lee did the second. He was able to get Davis to work with him to where he'd get many of the things that he needed. But he also had a problem where when a decision was made, he wouldn't back down from it. There was also a problem where people couldn't figure him out. They couldn't read him, where a lot of times they'd walk into his office and talk to him, and his eyes would be closed, and he'd kind of stick his face up toward him, and he'd be like, is he asleep? When he's really just trying to focus on what they were saying. So one of the things that he did the best he could with what he had. Once he was against secession, but once he became its president, he became a firm embracer of it, and he wrote 2 major volumes on the rise and fall of the Confederate government, which were in his mind defending the positions on Confederacy and on slavery. But those are some of the few ideas and some of the thoughts on President Davis. You'll see in some areas the exact opposite situation that Abraham Lincoln would have up in the North. More on that to come.